Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. We have a great episode for you today, folks. We have Professor Frances Widdowson joining us in just a few minutes. But first, I'm going to spend a bit of time providing some background, giving you a bit of a refresher on what has happened in Canada with the story of the unmarked graves and the legacy media hoax surrounding it. So we're going to go through a timeline. This episode is brought to you by Albertans Against No Fault Insurance. More on them later. So as you recall, back in May of 2021, the CBC published a bombshell report. This is what the headline said: remains of 215 children found buried at former BC residential school. That report was based on a press release that was put out by the Kamloops Indian Reserve. And let me tell you, the report was based on a preliminary finding. It wasn't a detailed report. It wasn't any hard evidence. It was just a claim that a report was forthcoming. Well, that didn't matter. The report went around the world, and the way that the media covered it globally was even more hysterical than the way the Canadian media reported it. So here you see the New York Times had this headline: horrible history, mass graves of Indigenous children reported in Canada. And so you can see how they went from unmarked graves to a mass grave. Well, the Canadian media quickly followed suit. The Toronto Star and others started calling them mass graves. Here is a report just 3 days later, May 31st, 2021, from the Toronto Star: mass grave of Indigenous children discovered at Kamloops, BC. We all remember how at the time Prime Minister Justin Trudeau jumped on these allegations. He wanted to be in front of them. He wanted to be Mr. Compassionate. And so here he was, photographed at one of the sites of another First Nations reserve, this one in Saskatchewan, that claimed to have found 751 unmarked graves, part of the same moral panic and story. And of course, the Prime Minister was more than happy to do his photo op there. In reality, that one cemetery, is worth pointing out, in Saskatchewan, that was not part of the residential school. Even in the initial Globe and Mail report that was published on July 19, 2021, tucked away at the end of the report, it quotes a band leader who said that they knew about the cemetery, that everybody knew about the cemetery. It was a rural municipal cemetery. It had people that were Indigenous and non-Indigenous buried there, and it was known by the entire community. That doesn't matter. The media narrative had already taken off on its own. By the end of 2021, here is the Canadian press named the discovery of the unmarked graves as the story of the year. It certainly was the most impactful, the most important story of 2021. Part of the problem, folks, to be perfectly honest, is that there was no pushback, right? Even the Conservative Party of Canada was more than happy to go along with this. They even participated in a motion in the House of Commons saying that genocide was committed. Of course, no such thing happened. Us at True North and here at the Candice Malcolm Show, we didn't buy it from the very beginning. We were skeptical. We were asking questions. In fact, in 2021, the same year, the Candice Malcolm Show, we named it the biggest fake news narrative of the year. It landed at #1. And I also published this piece earlier in the year, back in July of 2021, the 6 things the media got wrong about the graves found near the residential schools. I should have written the alleged graves found near the residential schools. That became the most read article in the history of True North. It was later surpassed by Cosmin George's reporting on the maps of the churches that had been burnt. We had a map of Canada, and we kept track of all of the churches that had been vandalized or burnt down or victims of arson. I think the total number is over 125 now, and that has since become the #1 piece that we have reported. But still, we were part of the small handful of Canadians that were pushing back against this narrative. And look, folks, the truth has come out. The truth has come out. More and more Canadians know that this story is not based on facts. There have been no human remains found at these residential schools. In Kamloops, there hasn't been any kind of an excavation at all. It's based on very sort of preliminary science and something called ground penetrating radar that suspects that there are anomalies. They don't even call them graves anymore. They call them anomalies. The few places where there have been excavations, no remains have found. And even the legacy media has been forced to admit that. So here is the CBC reporting in August of 2023. No evidence of human remains found beneath church at Pine Creek residential school site. So that was another one of these sites that was claimed to have bodies been found. When they did the excavation, none were found. There are several other examples of places where there have been excavations. In August 2021 in Nova Scotia, they conducted an excavation at a former site of a residential school. No bones were found. There's allegations of clandestine burials. Nothing was found. And then again in Edmonton, in October of 2021, there was an excavation done at the Camcell Hospital. And once again, no human remains were found. And so that is where we are today. I'm very pleased that True North was part of an important book that was published. We published this book called Grave Error. It was published in December of 2023. It quickly became the #1 best-selling book on Amazon in Canada, became a Canadian bestseller. And one of the authors is a collection of essays. It's edited by Dr. Champion and Tom Flanagan, a retired professor at the University of Calgary. One of the contributors to that book is Frances Widdowson. She is a political scientist and a free speech activist. She was an associate professor at Mount Royal University from 2008 until she was dismissed in 2021. I'm very pleased to welcome her to the show today. Frances, thank you so much for joining the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, first, I want to say that you were dismissed from your role at the Mount Royal University, but then your dismissal was deemed to be disproportionate. So after an arbiter ruled that the university had acted disproportionately when they dismissed you. So why don't you tell us what is the latest with you and Mount Royal University in Calgary?
Yes, so that decision came down last year. But unfortunately, the arbitrator decided that although I had been unjustly terminated, I could not be reinstated because of the friction that supposedly existed between me and a number of scholar activists at Mount Royal University who cannot tolerate their views being questioned. So my case is being appealed to the Alberta Labor Relations Board, and that appeal is going to be heard in December of this year. So we'll find out whether, hopefully, the Alberta Labor Relations Board will seriously look at this case. The arbitrator's decision, in my view, was seriously flawed, and the union agrees as well. So hopefully I will be reinstated very shortly to Mount Royal University and be back doing my research and classroom activities and providing a much needed counterbalance to the advocacy that is going on at Mount Royal University around things like the unmarked graves and the false claims that were made about that.
Well, I think the students at that university will be very lucky to have you back there. So let's talk a little bit about the book, Grave Error. So we published it at the very end of 2023. We just felt like we needed to have a counter piece of evidence, right? There's so much misinformation floating around in the media. And because of that, there's a perception, I think, in the minds of too many Canadians that something horrible, something akin to genocide happened at schools across the country. We just wanted something to be able to point to and say, like, hear the other side of the story, hear the side of the story that most Canadians believed up until about 5 years ago. And so you did a great service by providing that. Tell us a little bit about why you want to be involved in this project, and then some of the reaction to the book from your perspective.
So I wanted to be involved because from very early on, and just like yourself, I was quite skeptical about the claim that was made in May 2021, because I had been studying the residential schools since, I guess, 2016, after the Truth and Reconciliation report came out. And I thought that the report was very unbalanced and advocacy oriented and needed to be critically analyzed. And then when this claim came out, we actually held an event on July 10th, 2021 with Brian Giesbrecht and Rodney Clifton, where we were raising the alarm about how this was premature, claiming that remains had been found. And Brian Giesbrecht, in fact, raised the issue of the cemeteries, the abandoned cemeteries, of which there are many. But it turns out that Kamloops is not an abandoned cemetery because it is the apple orchard. And there's actually a cemetery on the reserve itself where some children from the residential school are buried. And there are many unmarked graves that are now unmarked in that cemetery because the markers have deteriorated. So I sensed that there were some problems with these claims, and I wanted them to be investigated. But it was a huge battle trying to get pieces published to critique that claim And this book was the first initiative, kind of written initiative, a compilation of the work of all the critics who had been working on this issue for a few years by the time that that book came out.
Well, it's interesting, Frances, because at the time when this happened, I was still writing in the Toronto Sun. I wrote for the Toronto Sun for about 8 years, finishing at the end of 2021. And so initially, I was writing columns on these stories, and I had no pushback whatsoever from my editor. They actually liked it because it was an interesting other side of the story, even though I will tell you in my personal life, friends, even professional colleagues, even people at True North, were opposed to what I was doing. Like I had a member of our board quit. I had an editor quit and rage over this stuff. Like they really didn't like this because it was so sensitive at the time, right? Everybody was so careful and worried, and they didn't want to be seen as sensitive. And even conservatives said, well, we didn't like the idea of the residential schools because it's a big government program, et cetera, et cetera. By the end of 2021, the Toronto Sun told me that I was no longer welcome to publish pieces. They didn't tell me why, but this was the kind of thing that I was writing a lot. And like I said, I said that it was the biggest hoax of 2021. So connecting those lines, I think that it was part of the reason. And you're right. There was almost no coverage of this in the legacy media, despite so many voices and so many people just asking really basic questions, not even making any claims, just asking questions about what the accusations were and asking for more facts. Now, I want to move this along. So in March of 2024, so some 3 months after this book was published, basically there was a controversy at the Quesnel City Council because this book was distributed to members of the city council by the wife of the mayor. And so the Quesnel City Council voted unanimously to denounce this book, saying that it downplayed the harms of the residential schools and First Nations, and councillors raised concerns that the mayor's wife had been distributing it. And so at that point, you were invited, or you decided to travel to Quesnel to speak at a city council meeting. And I have a clip from the city council meeting where you were basically told that you were not welcome there. Let's play that clip.
Does the council concern itself with misinformation? Is it opposed to misinformation being spread and entered into the record? If so, does it agree that this is misinformation because there is no evidence of unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School?
Her opinion in this chambers does not count. She's asking us to comment on something that comes from qualified individuals that dealt with this, that lived through this. Ma'am, you are not welcome here.
So, I mean, what a scene, right? Hundreds of people showing up, heckling you, booing you, and you just stating the facts, being very calm and measured, and sort of a hysterical reaction to you. So walk us through what happened, what brought you to Quesnel, and some background to that.
Yeah, so Pat Morton, as soon as I heard that Pat Morton was under fire for just sharing the book with a friend, and sending a copy to the school board saying that they might consider having it in their library, she got her husband, the mayor, got attacked. He was being attacked because of her, what she had done. Unfortunately, he sort of allowed himself to be, drawn into this discussion when he should have just said, look, my wife is not a public figure. She's allowed to share books with whoever she wants. Anyway, things started to get really nasty in Quesnel. And for example, her son has a tax business, and the band was, withdrew its business. And there was, it's a very small community, so it was not pleasant. And she heard there was going to be this terrible protest that was going to be happening. So she asked if any, person who was a contributor to Grave Era could come. And because I was in Calgary, I was sort of the person to I volunteered to do it and drive to Quesnel. And when I arrived there and was in the gallery, we were supposed to be given some time, I'm not sure what the time limit. I heard that we were going to be given, everyone was going to be given a certain amount of time to make a statement, but I thought that was going to be unlikely. So I knew, according to the rules, you could pose a question from the gallery. So I had both things planned. And then when I went up there, they allowed the Aboriginal, representatives to talk for, minutes on end about things completely unrelated to the agenda. And then they strictly controlled what Pat Morton and I could say. And then, but I had my question, the most important question, which was in this document from the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. They had the false claim that remains of or graves of 215 children have been found. And so I was asking a question specifically on that. And I was booed and treated absolutely horribly by these two counselors, Scott Elliott and another counselor's name is Lori Ann Rudenberg. They were unbelievable in their totalitarianism, and that whole meeting was a circus. And Pat Morton she was treated worse than me. So the whole thing was just an embarrassment for that city council. And there's a number of city councils who have similar problems, Powell River City Council and also Sechelt City Council. So it's a very dysfunctional situation in terms of the, Aboriginal groups being able to control what happens in city councils now.
Well, we're going to get to the documentary that you published, I think it was last month, where you do an excellent job sort of outlining the sort of post-truth world that we live in, where people don't even care about the truth. And you can say, like, hey, you said that this book is racist. Can you give me an example of how it's racist? And they'll basically accuse you of being racist for just even asking that question and saying that they don't need to have any evidence whatsoever. I want to talk about your interview with the CBC and with their young reporter out there named Jordan Tucker, which thankfully you recorded your own side of it, because this was an absolute train wreck and so embarrassing on behalf of the CBC. So this is all in the context of you going up to Quesnel. Maybe before I start playing some clips, can you sort of walk us through how this interview came to be? Did she just sort of reach out to you out of the blue, or had you been communicating with her in the past? Maybe just give us a bit of background.
Yes, so I never heard of her. I'd never interacted with her. She had obviously heard that I was coming to Quesnel and, wanted to, find out if there were nefarious things at work. And so she set up an interview with me. And I think this was the day before or 2 days before I went to Quesnel. And then we set up a Zoom call. This was on Zoom. I wish I had a I now know how to screen record. I wish I'd had a screen recording of that, but I just had audio on it. And I've never had an interview like that before. I've had bad interviews, but usually the interviews are quite professional. It's in the actual piece that is produced afterwards where the problem arises. But this interview, right from the start, she was making all these accusations, and that's what got me in such a confrontational kind of position, is because I was being asked all these questions about who was paying for my trip and whether I was financially benefiting from it. When, I was taking a great deal of time out of my own schedule. I was getting, probably going to get some expenses paid, but I wasn't making any money off of it. I was doing it purely to ensure that the city council was held to account for the libelous things that they were saying about, the contributors of the book Grave Error.
Okay, we've got a bunch of clips that we are going to play just in a moment, folks. I want to take a second, though, to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is Albertans Against No Fault. Did you know that the Alberta government is overhauling its auto insurance system? Under a new model called Care First, coming into effect in 2027, our sponsor argues that most Albertans injured in car accidents will no longer be able to sue the at-fault driver. Instead, decisions about your care and compensation will be made by the insurance company, not your doctor, not the courts. Critics say this system puts insurance companies first and removes key rights from victims and their families. Albertans Against No Fault Insurance is a campaign raising awareness of these changes. They're calling on the government to rethink this decision before it's too late. To learn more about how these changes could affect you and your family after a car accident, visit albertansagainstnofault.com. That's albertansagainstnofault.com. All right, Frances, I want to play. Let's go with the first clip that we have here, which is alluding to what you were saying, where the interviewer, Jordan Tucker, a CBC reporter, is pressing you on who's covering your travel funds. And then I've spliced it together with a clip later on where you talk about how she's wondering, why would people invent or embellish these claims? And you said, well, the government has given them $7 million. So that's pretty good incentive. $7 million, pretty good incentive to exaggerate your story. And she kind of like shrugs it off like, who cares about $7 million? So let's play that clip,
Are your travel expenses being paid by anyone? or are you paying them yourself?
We'll see what washes out of the whole thing.
What do you mean by that?
It depends on how much the expenses are, but I don't really see why I have to justify my travel to Quesnel to people. I'm coming perfectly.
Well, if you were invited.
I was invited, yes.
And you won't tell me by who. And I'm wondering, are you selling books? What's your motivation to go?
First of all, I received no money whatsoever for the books.
Don't you think that it's quite like a lot of trouble to go to say that 215 children died in order to get $7 million? There's a lot of other ways to get $7 million.
You could have made this up, right? First, you could sense in her voice just how insecure she is, how whiny. She just seems really upset. She doesn't want to have to justify anything she's doing. And she's really concerned over, I don't know what gas money from Calgary to Quesnel is, maybe a few $100s. And then like in the same breath, she's like, there's a lot of ways to get $7 million. Just totally unbelievable. I want to play one more clip for you here. This is unbelievable. This goes to show, folks, how ill-informed some members of the press are, and sadly, how many Canadians are. So the reporter, again, you would think that she would come to an interview prepared with facts, with research, probably having read the book, or at least the chapter that you could read. You just wrote one chapter of the book. I think it's like 25 pages. I get that it's not the easiest book to read, but you can get it at libraries across Canada. You could go and pick this book up, read it for free. Just even read Frances's one essay in there. You could tell she didn't do that. And in the interview, she claims as fact that 6,000 bodies have been found. 6,000 bodies found. And you asked her source, and she said the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which is a written report that came out in 2015. It doesn't even make any sense. These claims of unmarked graves didn't come out until 2021. You just get a snapshot of just how ignorant these people are. Let's play that clip, please.
Because there have been over 6,000 bodies found at this point. Are all of those
what bodies have been found?
I'm going with information from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and then various other government bodies.
But you said 6,000 bodies have been found.
That's the current number. Yeah, that's on.
And you say the Truth and Reconciliation Commission says that 6,000 bodies have been found?
Can I complete my questions, please?
You're the one who made that claim, and as a journalist, you should be concerned about the accuracy of your claims.
Unbelievable. So I guess just what was it like to be met with a CBC reporter like that?
I was amazed. I've never seen a level of incompetence, and she's not the head of the broadcasting department or anything. She's obviously sort of freelance and so on, but still the CBC used to be an important media institution that would have had some oversight and be training the people that work for it to do proper journalism, and that's obviously not happening at all anymore.
Well, absolutely. And so I'll just play one more clip from this interview. And folks, if you want to watch the whole thing, it's well worth your time. Frances has put it up on her YouTube page. We'll link that in the description so you can go. You'll either be like wildly entertained or just like sorely depressed at the state of the thinking behind the journalists in this country. But here is how the interview ends, which is Frances rightly calling this journalist out and discrediting her credibility. Let's play that clip.
I think you really need to read that book because you do not have an understanding at all.
Ma'am, I don't need that from you. Thank you.
Well, you are a seriously incompetent journalist. And this is what the CBC has sunk to these days.
I don't think that you accusing me or shouting at me is very helpful to your case.
Well, I don't really think I'm shouting at you. I'm just telling you, for someone who is here doing an interview on this case.
Please stop. Please stop. That's enough. This interview is now over. Thank you for your time.
I mean, just not to be too cruel to this young lady, but she was so unprepared for the interview. And anytime you called her on her BS or called her out for pushing total lies, she would just sort of like break character and be like, "I don't need this from you," or like, "Stop shouting at me," or "Stop interrupting me." And it's like, this is how you have a debate, right? It's like you're making claims that are false. So the person you're interviewing is calling you out on that, and rather than trying to back it up, she just sort of gets upset and pouts and has a temper tantrum. Okay, Frances, I want to show the audience what the CBC published, because this is just classic CBC deception, right? She records this long interview with you where she stumbles through the facts, she can't get her questions out, and then she gets upset. I think she was in tears and she ended the interview. And yet, to the CBC audience, this is, I believe it was a radio segment because we just have the soundbite of it, but this is how they presented it to the public. Let's play that SOT 5.
After Indigenous leaders called it harmful and painful. As Jordan Tucker tells us, the author won't say who invited her or if she's being paid for her travel costs.
There's terrible censoriousness.
Frances Widdowson co-wrote a book casting doubt on the harmfulness of Canada's residential schools. A former professor, she was fired from Calgary's Mount Royal University 3 years ago following her comments on the residential school system and the Black Lives Matter movement. The book features articles contesting evidence of unmarked graves at sites across the country.
As occurred in the case of the satanic panic. They are people who are distressed, who have their memories influenced by these sorts of things.
Unbelievable, Frances. This is why it's so important, folks. Anytime you're being recorded by, interviewed by the CBC or any journalist, record it yourself. Have your own copy of it so that you can bring the receipts and show the world the real interview. But what did you make of all that?
Yes, and the most serious thing, and I think it's very valuable for people to look at that interview, because it shows the thought process of not just this particular journalist, but people who believe this claim. And it was about her arguing that the 215 bodies have been found. We got into a big skirmish about this. And she said that, why would, all these smart people in the government, why would they believe this if it weren't true? Like, this is a journalist. A journalist is supposed to be, holding leaders to account and so on, but she is being completely credulous in her, in her interaction with leaders, politicians, Aboriginal leaders, and so on. So I think it's a very valuable thing to look at just from the thought processes that are going on about this case.
Well, in your chapter in Grave Error, you do talk about the moral panic of the 1980s with the satanic daycare scandal, which I didn't know that much about. I learned it from your book. But it seemed like in the interview, she was kind of drawing you down a bit of a rabbit hole. And then she took that one little clip and kind of played it out of context to make it seem like you were talking about satanic rituals or something like that. Like it was just classic bait and switch, like deceptive journalism. And I'm glad that you again posted it so that Canadians can see. Okay, Frances, I want to move on to this excellent documentary that you have released. And I don't know when it was published, but I watched it a few days ago, and it really is worth your time. It's called "What Remains: Exposing the Kamloops Mass Grave Deception's Impact on Powell River." So can you tell us about why you chose to do a documentary on Powell River, right? Like, I think that a lot of people are focusing on what's happened in Kamloops and that Indian reservation. Talk to us about what's happening in Powell River.
Yeah, so this documentary is actually the initial one in a series that Simon Hergott, who is a videographer and journalist, he was a journalist who worked for Global News for 10 years and was fired because of his opposition to the media outlets' coverage of a number of issues. He's an incredible talent, and he was the one who did most of the work on this documentary. I was involved in sort of with some of the background information that I had, and obviously was featured in it. But anyway, we're planning on doing another more in-depth kinds of examinations in the Kamloops case itself, and the massive institutional failure that has happened in the media, in the school board, the universities, and all these institutions, which really explain why this deception has taken root. But what people don't understand is that although this happened in Kamloops, this claim that was made in May 2021 has had far-reaching consequences. And one of the consequences was in the town of Powell River, where this claim was used by the chief of the local Indian band to make the demand that the town's name should be changed. And it turns out, and another reason was that the town was supposedly named after Israel Wood Powell, who was the superintendent, it was a head official in the Department of Indian Affairs. It turns out that the town was not even named after Israel Wood Powell. It was named after Edward Powell, who was a cartographer who had mapped the area. So both of the claims behind why this town's name should be changed were not correct, yet they're still continuing to press for this. And this has completely ripped apart this community. And this is the kind of thing that these so-called truth and reconciliation efforts do, is that they have nothing to do with truth. It is about, these fomenting these falsehoods so that, grievances can be stirred up. And then, of course, it results in all these fights between people, which then benefit all the legal disputes that are going to emerge out of all these interactions. And one of the biggest things that's happened that has also impacted Powell River is the Kamloops claim was used to push through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into federal legislation. There was opposition from both the Conservative Party and 6 provinces. And when that claim was made, everyone just was saying, well, what can we do to right this wrong? And that allowed that legislation to be pushed through. So now we've got to deal with a whole bunch of implications of what it means to have this kind of internationalist notion undermine Canadian sovereignty, and all the disputes, all the legal disputes that are going to result from that. So we went into Powell River, Simon Hergott and me, and did a lot of footage of the various kinds of problems that existed in Powell River. And it was quite a fascinating case study, which showed a lot of the flawed thought processes that are occurring with respect to the Kamloops case.
Well, you do an excellent job. The documentary does an excellent job debunking some of the prevalencies, exposing the sort of industry around First Nations, like the consultants and sometimes even the academic professors. You debunked a New York Times documentary or clip segment pretending to show that they had found babies buried, and you had a geophysicist who said, there's no way, these images that the guy's showing on the screen are maybe 10 to 12 centimeters. Those aren't remains of humans. Those are probably boulders or animal burrows. There's another part where a protester shows up to protest you. You confront her. We're going to play this clip of you just trying to engage with a protester and just showing how totally unprepared and unwilling these people are to debate their ideas. Let's play Sod 8, please.
Could you explain to me your position?
No.
Are you not interested in what my arguments are?
I know what they are.
Okay, so what are my arguments?
I don't need to speak your work back to you. I'm not in a lecture. I'm not your student. I won't be summarizing your work for you.
No, but do you want to be accurate in the way you're portraying my work? Do you think that being accurate?
You think your work isn't racist?
But you think it is.
Yes.
So why do you think it's racist?
It fully is racist.
But what if you're going to say that my work is racist? Don't you think that you have a responsibility to say why you think it's racist?
Not to you.
So, it would be funny, again, if it weren't so depressing, the state of our country and how these people are totally unwilling. Like, I was even looking, Frances, before this episode to see if anyone had written a thoughtful rebuke or like criticism of grave error, to see if anyone had kind of gone through it and tried to debunk it. And for best I could tell, there hasn't been any effort to do anything like that. There's another part in your video that just sort of shows it's almost like a nihilism, right? It's like people don't care about what the truth is. They just care that someone's truth. It's like we have to respect their truth. And it does sort of show a sad state of affairs in British Columbia. Any final thoughts, and where can people find the documentary?
Yeah, so it's on YouTube. The documentary, you can just it's Frances Widdowson 1600, and we are now fundraising to try to produce a whole bunch of other related documentaries on the institutional failure that has surrounded the Kamloops case, especially in the universities and in the media, but also institutions like the RCMP and the school board and the coroner's office, just endless institutions that if they had been operating properly, they would have been able to sound the alarm and, created a bit of caution about people making these outlandish claims. And it just doesn't stop, because now we have the Cooper Island residential school case, which is just as crazy. And everyone, all the journalists are just covering this in the exact same way, which is just completely lacking in any kind of skepticism and any kind of critical questioning of the claims that Aboriginal leaders and their lawyers and their consultants are making with respect to these unmarked graves.
Well, I definitely encourage everyone to go out and watch the documentary and support Frances's work, allow her to do more of these important documentaries to help get the truth out there. Frances, thank you so much for your time, and keep up the great work.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you, and God bless.